This is Tyler, your antisocial critic and the host of the AntiSocial Network, your number one source for anachronistic conversations online. Come join us each week to hear opinions from some of the best voices discussing entertainment, politics, religion, and modern life on the internet today, most of which you've never heard of, but I have. Joining this week on AntiSocial Theology is Fiene. I just messed it up, didn't I?
You did. Hans Fiene.
Hans Fiene. I
Nope.
swear.
Hans Fiene.
No, I'm at least a third Nordic. I should be able to get this right. I don't know.
Oh, that's shameful. Gosh.
Well, it's not my fault. The
ancestors.
The other 2/3 is Anglo, so I can't control that. So.
Well.
Well, apologies for that preemptively. I made.
That's all right.
But yeah, he's a pastor from the far side of Illinois, and he's the creator of Lutheran Satire, a contributor to the Federalist. I'm not sure if there's anything else you want to add to that list, but it's pretty.
Well,
list.
I'm actually in St. Louis now.
Okay, well, I'm in Chicago, so you're on the other side of the state to me. So.
Yeah, I escaped. I was in Illinois for almost 10 years. And then in the midst of COVID, in the dark of night, I snuck out.
Well, you're in the tolerable part of the state at the very least. You don't.
Yeah, where we live was actually quite nice. I mean, it was an hour southwest of the city, so you didn't have to deal with. You were close enough to the city where you could get all the benefits of it. And Chicago, for all of the negative attention it gets in the media, it really is a fantastic city. Apart from all of the bad government and crime and stuff like that, just an absolutely fantastic city. Great food town, architecturally, probably the most beautiful city in the country. But so we were close enough that you could go to the museums and kind of do that stuff, but far enough away that we didn't have to deal with the traffic and all that business. But very glad to be in St. Louis now.
Yeah, I mean, I have the same thoughts about Illinois. The only problem I have with it is just the property taxes, really. That's what kills you.
Oh, yeah. That's insane. When we first moved there, and we bought a house this was like 2010, so it was the bottom of the market, early 2011 maybe. And so it was as cheap as houses have been for a long time. And our property taxes were still just astonishing. And I would talk to people about it, and they go, oh, yeah, but the schools are really good, though. And I kind of thought, for the amount of money I'm paying in property taxes, my kid should have his own personal masseuse. That's how good the schools should be. Is that my kid should come home at the end of every day knowing everything that has ever happened. So if you ask him about history, he just knows all of the events. You could just go 1327 AD, and he could tell you what every person on earth was doing at that point. That's the only way that the property taxes are worth it.
Yeah, unfortunately, they're not. So,
yeah.
Where did you do your seminary then? If you didn't grow up in Illinois?
Well, I went to seminary at Concordia Theological Seminary in lovely Fort Wayne, Indiana. So I'm a pastor in the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, which is we're the second largest Lutheran church body in the country, but we're the largest actually Lutheran church body in the country. So the largest one, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, is kind of like standard mainline Protestant, gone off the rails type of thing. Fairly indistinguishable from the Episcopalians, stuff like that at this point. So Lutheran Church Missouri Synod has two seminaries, one here in St. Louis, and then one in Fort Wayne, Indiana. And so that's where I went to seminary. I'm from Indiana. I grew up about just outside of Indianapolis, about 2 hours away from where I went to seminary. But I've lived kind of all over. My dad was a pastor as well. So I was born in Minnesota, lived in Utah and Connecticut. So I've kind of been everywhere in various different cultures. I attribute a lot of my sense of humor to that because I lived in Utah for a number of years as a kid, which is very polite and G-rated. And then I moved to Connecticut, which is the East Coast, which is the opposite of those things. So I have a very dark sense of humor, but I don't like profanity and potty humor, or sort of risque humor. So I like the veneer of politeness with bitter, biting cynicism beneath it. That's kind of how that works for me. That
might be the magical alchemy for comedy then, because that seems to be There's a great line in one of Jonah Goldberg's early books where he says there's a reason why comedians are so common for women, blacks, and Canadians. It's because you kind of have to have that insider-outsider view on life to be able to kind
Right.
of...
Yeah, no, yeah, I think that's true. And comedy is noticing that there's something wrong with the world. So I actually think that I think Christian comedy, like a lot of times Christian stand-up comedy it's not what it could be. A lot of times the genre is like, here's the guy who doesn't swear and he goes to churches on Sunday mornings and does a routine in churches, instead of stand-up clubs. And that tends to not be very great. But in terms of recognizing that there's something wrong with the world nothing empowers you to be able to laugh at the misery of the world more than knowing that you win in the end, right? So it's certainly how it's like in your life when bad things happen to you, or like not bad things in like terms of like death or whatever, but bad things in terms of you slip and fall on the ice, right? So and it hurts for a moment, and for a second you're worried that you're going to need to go to the hospital. So it's not funny then, but if you think back to it, later that day, it's funny. And being a Christian, the great joy of that is that all of the sorrows and miseries of this world, like we're going to win in the end. So you already know how things are going to turn out. So you can point out the foolishness of the world and you can laugh at it, but you don't get kind of overwhelmed by it because you know how the story is going to end.
So that's a good transition into Lutheran Satire. How did you kind of come about with your channel?
Yeah, so it started about 10 years ago. I always loved sketch comedy growing up. I watched a ton of Monty Python, a good amount of Saturday Night Live and things of that nature. And a couple of years before it started, I wrote a skit. I don't even really remember what it was, but it was intending to teach. I wasn't really trying to teach anyone because I didn't think of it in terms of an audience. It was just sort of a funny observation. I think if I remember now, the idea was it's the bit in the Gospels where I think in Matthew in particular, his Passion account, where Pilate writes the King of the Jews right above on the sign above Christ's cross, and they go, no, don't write the King of the Jews, but this man said he was the King of the Jews. And what I was thinking of was this kind of common line that you get amongst secularists where people will say that Jesus was put to death for challenging the status quo and for teaching us to love one another, right? Which is a line I've heard a lot of times. And I was just trying to think of if that person were in that scenario with Pontius Pilate, like, it's because it's always such a silly argument that Jesus was put to death because he told us to be nice to each other. It's very clearly not the reason why. And what would the people who have, in that scenario where those people exist, what would their conversation with Pilate have been like? So it was some sort of skit where it was, he told us to be nice, and so that's what we want to put, like, we want to drop kick puppies, and steal old ladies' wigs, and kind of things of that nature. So that's what life is really about. But this guy told us not to do that stuff, to kind of highlight the absurdity of that claim. So I wrote that skit, and I didn't have anything to do with it because this was very kind of early on in YouTube, and I didn't have any animation software and anything like that. And so I didn't know what to do with it. So it kind of sat on the shelf. And then a friend of mine pointed out to me this software that existed at the time that was text to type stuff. So it had these computer generated actors, and you just typed it in the dialogue and then they would read it. So my early videos are all using that, and they're what I call the robo voice era, where it was just a robotic voice, and I could make them pretty fast. Once I wrote a script, it would take me maybe 10 minutes to put the video together, but it was very limited in the sense that I only had a certain number of characters. They all looked like cartoonish but modern, 21st century people. I only had so many voices that I could use, so I had to write in a style where the comedy worked for that kind of deadpan robotic delivery. So then I eventually transitioned into doing lightly animated stuff, so with pre-existing characters that a friend of mine drew for me. threw into an animation software that would kind of recognize all the parts of their face, and then you plug in the audio that you recorded, and it makes them talk and stuff like that. So the way I do them now is much more time consuming. I can do a lot more with it, but they take a lot longer to make, which is why I don't make them as often.
Sure. What is your general approach? Like, do you do all the animation yourself now, or do you have help?
I have help with. I have a friend of mine who draws the characters. So, like the Donald O'Connell characters, the Horace character, basically pretty much everyone like that are drawn by a friend of mine named Matthew Carver, who's a really talented artist and really great translator as well. For those of you who are interested in ancient Lutheran scholastic writings, he's got you covered. But he'll send me those. I plug them into the software and basically do all the animation. It's not a lot of animation. The program itself, moves the mouths to make the U sounds and O sounds and whatever for the speech. And then kind of, light movement of characters and stuff like that. So yeah, I mean, I have plans to outsource some stuff that's a bit more complicated that I just don't have the time to do. That's really kind of it more than anything, is that it's just a time consuming process to animate, and the software that I have is not super great for that. But I don't have time to learn a new software. So it's, at some point I've got a few projects that I want to outsource, but yeah, for the most part, pretty much everything I've done so far has been Matt Carver doing the drawings and then me kind of doing everything else.
How much does that bleed into your real life ministry? Do people you work with normally know you do these, or is this something you just kind of do for fun on the side? Or
yeah, it's kind of a combination of the two. It's been a weird thing for me in some ways to figure out like how much of this is work and how much of it isn't. And I think I was thinking about this the other day that there's a debate. There's been a debate in recent, in history in the last 100 or so years, 150 years, 200 years, whatever, about the merits of street preaching. And, and some church bodies have a strong tradition in believing in street preaching, and others not so much. And I was thinking about this the other day, and I realized that that's actually what social media is now. So social media is street preaching. So if you're talking theology on Twitter, that's street preaching. If you're putting up videos on YouTube, that's street preaching. Because street preaching is really just find a place where lots of people are walking by, hope to grab their attention, and then hope that they will listen to you. Well, we don't really, depending on where you live, that may not literally exist in your world for a huge percentage of the country. There's not a spot where you can just start saying words out loud and there's going to be pedestrian traffic to hear them. But social media works that way very much. So for me, in a lot of ways, I see what I do as it's second fiddle to my work as a parish pastor. But it's still very much connected with it. And then it gives me an opportunity to teach. It gives me an opportunity to confess what Lutherans believe. And primarily the way I see Lutheran satire is, it's not so much that I expect anyone to watch a Lutheran satire video and go, oh, cool, I'm a Lutheran now. But rather for them to watch it and to say, oh, I didn't, because Lutherans tend to kind of not be on people's radar for whatever reason. And there are long, complex explanations for why this is the case. But, typically if you have someone who hasn't grown up Christian, and is kind of interested in learning more about it, I think a lot of times there's a perception in people of, well, evangelicals are kind of those are the big churches that everyone goes to, so let's maybe give that a shot. Or people kind of get the sense that Roman Catholics are sort of the OGs, so maybe we should check that out. And Lutherans are kind of this weird thing in the middle where we don't have the mega churches, but we don't in the popular consciousness have that kind of history and legacy of the Roman Catholic Church. So we tend to be a little bit invisible. But I certainly believe that we have a tremendous amount of gospel comfort to offer people. And so one of the things that I hope for with my videos is by just kind of throwing that out there and taking on a certain topic that someone will come across that and say, oh, I didn't I didn't know what Lutherans taught about this one way or another. I've never really considered Lutherans before. Well, what are these Lutherans of which you speak, and how can I learn more about them? So, like the most rewarding response I've gotten from people throughout the years has been, I watched your video on whatever the topic was. I kind of felt like what I was hearing from other churches wasn't quite right. You expressed something that seemed to be right to me, so I wanted to learn more about it. So I went and visited, my local church, and now I became a Lutheran. So that's kind of, that to me is when I see Lutheran satire working the way that I hope for it to. So in my previous congregation, I had a guy who had been a Jehovah's Witness who saw the videos that I did on the Jehovah's Witnesses and thought, oh, I wonder what's up with these Lutherans. And then he very conveniently lived in the same town that I did. So he was able to actually just, drive a mile down the road or whatever it was and meet with me, which was nice. Because I always like it when people go, oh, I watched your videos and now I go to another Lutheran pastor's church. And there's always a part of me that's like, can we get like a 10% finder's fee off of your offerings or something like that? Just a tithe of your tithe, just to make it work. But so that's basically kind of where it came from and what the goal of it is, I suppose.
What did you said your father was a pastor? Is that how you came into Lutheranism, or is that something you came into later in your?
I'm about as historically Lutheran as it gets. So both my parents are Lutheran, and kind of jumping back on sides of the family tree. Once you get to so my dad's a pastor, my mom's dad's a pastor, my dad's grandfather was a pastor, and then basically from there it's pretty much Lutheran pastors all the way back to the Reformation. So my family has been Lutheran as long as there have been Lutherans, basically.
Wow, my family just ping-ponged me between so many different churches it wasn't even funny. Genetically speaking, I'm 75% Southern Baptist, 25% Methodist. But then I spent my entire childhood at evangelical big box churches. Then I spent a couple of years at a Lutheran church, then back to Baptist, now even more contemporary, non-denominational, and now I'm trying to figure out where I am. I took a test recently and it said I'm Episcopalian of all things, which I don't know how that came out, but...
that sounds dangerous. You should get that checked out.
I've heard terrible
things. Go to a doctor.
It's like the Disneyland joke from The Simpsons. It's like, I'm going to Disneyland. Really, I've heard nothing but terrible things. Same with the Episcopalians. But
yeah.
So, what is it about Lutheranism that kept you drawing into it? Because obviously, everyone goes through a phase where they have to actively choose that. And I mean, there aren't many people that are born Christian and just stay that without any sort of having to question it.
Right. Yeah. There's always kind of a period where you go through some sort of doubts or whatever that might be. I think for me it was I grew up in a very Lutheran family, so a lot of my uncles were pastors. I grew up like going up to our vacation home, which was up at a lake in Minnesota, where I'd hang out with my cousins and I'd watch my parents hanging out, with relatives, and we'd sit around and we'd talk theology all the time. So for me, it was never. I wasn't one of those kids who was kind of like. Sometimes this I think happens with pastors' kids, where they either grow up in very legalistic traditions, where they're basically taught you need to be better than everyone else, and then they kind of crumble under the pressure. And then there are kids who may grow up in situations where their dad, their parents may see how it has gone for other kids and said, oh, we don't want that to happen to our kid, so we're going to kind of give him as much distance as possible. And neither of those are good approaches. Because in one, you just end up hammering people to the point where they're just crushed by the law and they feel like they're destined for failure. So what's the point of trying? It's kind of like my analogy for it has been, it's like when you're in school. I don't know if you ever had this happen where you were taking a test and you realized about 5 questions in that you were going to fail the test. So you get to the point where you go, I might as well fail this spectacularly. So you get the short answers and you just write in something, absurd. Tell me about the Louisiana Purchase. And you're talking about, well, there was a group of chickens and they crossed the Mississippi River, or whatever it might be. And so you just figure out, I'll just give up on it. Or the other problem is, for me, I think the people I've met in my life that are the most hostile to the faith are not people who grew up completely outside of the church. It's not people who were Muslims or grew up even in totally secular households. They usually will have some degree of curiosity about what you believe, in the same way that if I see a Zoroastrian walking down the street, I'm not going to be like, lousy Zoroastrian. I'm going to go, I don't really know. Can you tell me more kind of about what that is? It doesn't mean that I'm necessarily going to believe it, but there's a level of curiosity there. But the people I know in my life who are the least curious as to what Christianity actually is, and who are the most certain that they know what it is, and they always think it's some ridiculous cartoonish thing, are the people who were kind of raised in it. The people who got enough Jesus to think that they know who he is, and therefore cannot be convinced that they don't know what they're talking about. So that, I think, can sometimes be a risk for growing up in the church, is that you get a little bit of it, but you're not immersed in it enough to actually it's almost like you're immunized against it. It's like the idea of a vaccine where you get a tiny little bit of the virus and you get enough to just make you resist it. But for me, it was kind of always there. I grew up in Utah for a number of years. So that was a big part of life, was just, I lived in an area that was 85% Mormon. And you had to, as early as I can remember, I had to know the differences between Mormons and Christians. I had to understand why my Mormon friends, believed some of the things that they believed, how they were different, kind of things of that nature. Why they weren't baptized, why they talked about kind of the same type of things that we did, but in a way that was different, and I couldn't quite, kind of put my finger on. And so that was just sort of always there. And I think that had a very formative effect on me, that you kind of knew there was some sort of battle going on. And I went to college, and there was never really a period where I was out of the church. I mean, there was certainly a period where I was a lazy college kid, and was not as engaged as I am now. But there was never a point in my life when I would have told you that I wasn't a Christian, that I didn't believe, or that I felt compelled to find something other than Lutheranism, because I had such an active dialogue with my friends growing up, that I was able to know what they believed, able to see how that affected their lives, able to see kind of a whole host of things. So I never felt like I was lacking anything in being a Lutheran. And my dad's a great preacher. I grew up hearing the gospel all the time. So by the time I decided I wanted to go to the ministry, it wasn't like I had kind of rediscovered something. It was more so that to use kind of a corny analogy, it's like in one of those, romantic comedies that my wife likes to watch, where the boy next door and the girl next door who, always kind of been in love with each other, but then he goes off to do something and she goes off to do something. And then he kind of, finally realizes, oh, this thing that's, kind of been in front of me this whole time is the way to go. So that, but not nearly that romantic, because in a lot of ways, I feel like being a pastor is, my analogy for it is that it's like walking down the street and hearing people screaming from a burning building. And you think to yourself, all right, well, I can hold my breath for a long time and I've got a strong back. So, I can rush in and help. But it's not that you like really, really want to. It's that you go, shoot, someone has to do this. And I think I can do it. I think I know the thing. I think I have an understanding of the way that things work, what the vocation, requires of you. I think I can do that. That's kind of for me how I approach things. I'm always a little nervous of guys who have this very kind of romantic or high notion of that they just felt called into something so beautiful and wonderful that being a pastor it's a beautiful and a wonderful calling, but a lot of times it's tough and frustrating, and people are irritating, and you irritate yourself, with your own failings and sins. So in large part, it's more so just like a grudging realization that God gave you the skills that were necessary for doing this. Like one of the things that, for example, probably the best illustration of this I could give is when I was in college, I was in a band, and I really, really, really wanted to be a rock singer. And I was in a really great band. I was in a band with some really great musicians, but I'm a low baritone. I can't sing that stuff. I can try, and I could try to write it, but I wasn't very good at it. And then I thought for a minute about maybe moving to Nashville to be a songwriter in between college and then before I decided to go to seminary. But I don't really like country music. So it's, a little bit difficult to, I could sing it fairly well, but I don't really love it. So then I go to the seminary and I start chanting our liturgy, in our services. And I realize, this is actually like the perfect range for where my voice is. And so it's that kind of grudging realization that you go, all right, shoot, well, God gave me some gifts and talents. I wanted to use them to become famous and rich. and then God sort of goes, no, you're going to use them for another purpose. And you go, fine, all right, I guess I will do that. Which to me is a much more biblical model than, like everyone in the Bible doesn't want to do it when God says, hey, it says to Moses, like, hey, how about you go set my people free? And Moses goes, if you could find someone else, that would be great, and Jonah runs away, and Jeremiah says to God, no, how about someone else does this and not me? So I feel like if you are a pastor and you really don't feel like doing it a lot of days, you're in much better company than if you wake up every morning and are super energized about it.
Sure. And with your YouTube channel, nowadays especially, it seems like there's kind of a strange renaissance of Christian comedy kind of coming about. I don't know how successful your channel is compared to others, but I mean, definitely there's stuff like the Babylon Bee happening right now, where there's something weird in the water that's starting to make Christian comedy a little actually funny.
Yeah, well, I think part of it is, if you just sort of ask yourself comedy is always at its best when you're the outsider, right? So if you're at a comedy club and a guy gets up at amateur hour and he's super good looking and wealthy, and he gets up and he's like, oh, you ever have that thing happen where you're on your yacht and the engine goes out, and people are like, I can't relate to this. That's not, your life sounds pretty awesome. You should stop complaining about it, or that the comedian is the guy who's willing to say the things that other people aren't, and willing to make the observations that other people aren't, So it's not funny if you get up, like if a guy gets up and he's like, boy, murder sure is bad, right, guys? And everyone's like, yeah, we kind of all agree that murder's pretty bad. So it's not a funny observation. But when you're kind of countercultural and you're outside of the mainstream, that actually is able to kind of craft a voice that, because you're trying to express things that people haven't necessarily considered before. And one of the great things about comedy is that it enables you to come just right up to someone and say something that they wouldn't really otherwise let you say, but because you're doing it from a comedic angle and you're able to pick things apart for them from a perspective that they wouldn't have otherwise considered, it just kind of works. It's, when I was in college, I used to do these madrigal dinners. I liked doing them. I didn't like putting on the tights and the medieval costume, but I liked doing them because I could walk up to the most gorgeous girls I'd ever seen and just shamelessly flirt with them. Because when you had the accents and when you're putting on a routine, there's just enough of a barrier there where you're able to save face if things, kind of go sideways, and where it disarms them, where they feel like this is just an act, so they can take from it what they want. So the girl can feel like, oh, this guy's sweet and he's telling me that I'm really pretty, but it doesn't have the creep factor that it would, like if I just walked up in my regular voice, while you were taking, a political science final, and I was just like, you're the most beautiful girl I've ever seen in my entire life. There's more of a creep factor to that. And there's something similar with that, where where you can walk right up to an issue and start picking it apart, and people are disarmed enough that they'll let you do it. And so when you're kind of the outsider, when you're very clearly outside of the culture, I think that's a big thing for kind of driving Christian comedy. And I think too that there just was kind of a cultural. I think there's been a cultural shift in recent years with Christian media that we're not trying to do the Christian version of a pre-existing secular thing. That whether it's stuff that the Bee is putting out, so even though that's kind of taking the model of pre-existing satirical institutions like the Onion, it's not really trying to be the Christian version of the Onion. It's just kind of taking that kind of shared venue and doing that. But that because I feel like when I was growing up, and I had friends who would go to evangelical churches, and their moms were like super big on making sure that they weren't listening to music with bad words in it and stuff like that. And I'm just not a criticism of that, but they didn't have their kids listening to hymns. So it wasn't like they said, "Oh, okay, we don't want you listening to this awful secular music. Here's a bunch of Bach cantatas that you should listen to." It was, here's some dorky Christian rapper who does a really bad Christian version of the other thing. And I think there's been just sort of a cultural shift where because the medium has changed, and because YouTube in particular and other venues let you just do whatever you want, so you can throw it out there, and if people find it, they find it, and if it blows up, it blows up. So you don't need to go to some money person, some person with money, and say, "Hey, invest in this thing that there's no model for this being successful." Right? Like with Lutheran Satire, if I had been who I was, if I'd been the same person that I was and had just been born 10 years earlier, and prior to YouTube being available, if I went to my church body and I said, "Can I have some money? Can I have some mission funds so I can get a camera and a bunch of stuff and make these short videos where I'm making fun of stuff and it's goofy and silly and intending to teach the faith?" They would have said, "Oh no, that seems like a bad idea. There's no return on investment for that. We think we would just kind of be throwing bad money after that." Instead, I was just able to put it up on YouTube, and then it, within the small world of Christian media, ends up becoming a sizable thing. So I think that's part of it too, is that you don't need to convince someone who hasn't figured out where media and human communication is going to invest in the thing. You can just do it, and then it kind of goes where it goes, and that enables you to just be a lot freer with your content. So, and I think that one of the things about Christian comedy that it offers in whatever form, whether that's stand up or stuff that I'm doing or stuff that the Bee is doing, whatever it might be, one of the things it offers hope in a way that modern comedy doesn't. And that's ultimately what it is that people need. So it's great if you're able to laugh, but you also want to have some hope that this kind of miserable state of the world is not going to stay that way. And the fact that we can offer that to people in a way that the secular world can't, I think certainly gives us a leg up in that, because it's like if Christians were the only ones who made movies that had happy endings, then Christian movies would be infinitely more popular. So if Christian movies, if in secular movies the superhero, gives up heroism and dies, on a cocaine binge at the end of every movie, and then in Christian movies he saves the day and then he goes off, to start a journey to save someone else, like we would do better in those fields. And I think so much comedy today is just kind of nihilistic, and it offers people no hope. That if you can actually present things from a perspective of that perspective of look at the wonderful things that Christ actually has to give you, it puts you in a position where you have a wonderful opportunity to make a good confession to folks.
I mean, I know you're a fairly politically aware person, but where do you think that bodes for the direction of things? Like, in terms of if we're the counterculture now when we weren't 15 years ago, what is that a bad sign or a good sign that things are moving in the way we want it to go?
Well, I mean, yeah, there's good and bad. I mean, I think what we're really seeing very clearly, and this has even just ramped up, I mean, just in the past couple of months, let alone, the past couple of years. But that there's a very concerted effort on the left to take away platforms and to take away the ability of people to speak that they don't agree with. And Christians are certainly going to be targeted for that, and there are already being targeted for that. I mean, so like if you were just to quote, if you were just throw Bible verses, up on social media, and for a lot of, very well may end up with you getting banned from social media just for taking 2,000-year-old words and sticking them on the internet. So I think things will definitely get worse in that sense, that the secular left is going to keep pushing in that direction, and I think a lot of that is driven by it's driven by a fear and an insecurity of a worldview. I think people kind of naturally understand when they can't win an argument, so they just try to not have the argument. So the problem is that if you have platforms that have typically allowed any perspective, the mere utterance of those words is violence, towards people who don't agree with them, whatever that might be. That's the justification, but I think the deeper thing is a worldview that doesn't believe in forgiveness is going to lose out to one that does eventually over time. And so in a lot of ways, I mean, I think there's plenty of reason for Christians to be hopeful, because we have objectively a better product to offer people than the world does. That when you have the blood of Jesus that heals all divisions, that's a much better product to offer people than perpetual grievances. One of the things with the left is that the way you become righteous in the eyes of the left is by identifying some marginalized group and then screaming about how they're marginalized. And the problem is eventually you run out of groups, so you have to just create new categories. So that's how the left was able to go in just the span of a few years from being obsessed with legalizing gay marriage to like people just boldly and without hesitation saying that a 5-year-old boy who decides that he's a girl should be able to be, put on hormone blockers. I mean, just like the most insane thing that nobody on the face of the planet believed 45 seconds ago just becomes unquestionable dogma to folks, and that's a worldview that's just gonna burn out. It's like, I don't know. It's like looking at Guns N' Roses, right? So I grew up as a kid of the late '80s, early '90s, and a band like Guns N' Roses they weren't going to last for 40 years. So the thing that made you great was that you were drug-addled, volatile people, some struggling with mental illness, with like severe behavioral disorders, right? And that makes a great explosion, and really cool music can come out of that great explosion, but it doesn't last for very long. It's just going to burn out. And I think that's kind of the same thing I see with the left is you can't have if you have a worldview that hates children, that hates procreation, that hates marital faithfulness, that hates the very concepts of male and female, and also that espouses things that are not readily apparent to people. That's like another big thing is that you have to if you don't believe that male and female are real distinctions, you have to teach that to every generation of people, because every 2-year-old kid on the planet knows mommy's a girl, daddy's a boy. And so the only way you can keep teaching that is through just a steady regiment of consistent propaganda. That's that. So in other words, gasoline. That you have to just pour gasoline on things and set them on fire. And you might get some really cool explosions. You might win some really big victories, but it's not, in the grand scheme of things, it's not going to be that long before you become so absurd and your abuse of people becomes so readily apparent. It's not sustainable. So my typical view of things in terms of like, how are things going to go for Christians, in the next however many years, is short-term things are going to be really bad. They're going to get super hostile, and Christians really need to be prepared for that. You need to be ready to lose your friends. You need to be ready to face governmental persecution and all of that stuff. So in the short term, we need to be geared up for that and be ready to expect it. And if you are still of the mindset that you can reason with the mob, you need to get out of the way and let people who actually understand the threats that we're facing be the ones, taking the wheels of our various Christian institutions. So if you don't think it's reasonable, to assume that pastors who are getting ordained now could very well in 5 or 10 years be thrown in jail for believing and teaching what it is that they're being taught. If you don't think that's a reasonable timeline, you need to retire and get out of the way and let someone head up your seminaries or whatever the institution is that recognizes that that's a real threat. But long term, I think things are pretty great. I think things are going to be great because the left will consume itself and devour itself and blow up the way that these things typically do. And then the Christians will be there to kind of put things back in order. But the caveat of that is we need to actually still be there to do that, which means that right now we need to be figuring out, how do we get from where we are now with the world as hostile as it is, how do we survive to the point where the secular world blows up and we're needed to kind of put things back in order. And I certainly don't think it's like the Benedict option kind of idea of, well, you just go retreat from the world, because the world will find you. You're not allowed to opt out of the culture wars. You're not allowed to not play. So you're not allowed to just go, well, you take over the universities and all of that stuff, and we'll just go over here. They'll find whatever you build. So if we're reaching the point where if a mob decides that they think you're an evil person for X, Y, and Z, they'll just hound Bank of America for or whatever your bank might be, for the fact that they're letting you, that they're keeping your money, or whatever it might be. And the direction that things could go can certainly be quite bad. So if we can be smart and forward thinking and wise enough to weather the storm, once the storm is over, we'll be in a good place. I'm convinced that my great grandchildren will inherit a good world if Christians can hold enough ground to kind of expand once the storm is over. It's more so that I'm much more concerned about the world that my kids and my grandkids are going to be inheriting.
Sure. So I think we're both running out of time. We both got stuff after this. Do you want to just kind of plug all your stuff real quick and tell people where they can find you?
Well, Lutheransatire.org. You can find all my videos and stuff there. You can also just on YouTube as well, just type in Lutheran Satire. If you're in the St. Louis area and would like to pay us a visit at Prince of Peace Lutheran Church in lovely Crestwood, Missouri, you are more than welcome to do so. You can find me on Twitter at Hans Fiene, HANSFIENE. I also have a Lutheran Satire account. I don't use that one nearly as much, just to kind of post videos and stuff like that. So there you go. That's my stuff.
Cool. Well, it was good to meet you. I appreciate talking.
Hey, it was great to talk to you as well.
Sure. Have a good day. God bless.
You too.
The AntiSocial Network is a Groupthink Productions podcast. Editing, producing, and hosting are by Tyler Hummel, artwork by Crystal Cowley, and original music was composed by Melissa Lafira and the late Dan Smolla. Like, subscribe, and please let us know what you think about the show in the comments below if you'd like to see anyone interesting be a guest on the show. Thank you for listening.